Heavenly Father, Lord God, thank you so much for this opportunity to come together and to have a conversation. We pray and ask that you teach us, that you guide us, be with our technology, be with all the persons and families involved, and guide us into all truth. In Jesus' name, amen. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of What's the Message? I am your host, Claudia Allen, and I am so excited to be joined once again with my co-host, my editor-in-chief, the lady who gets it all done, the Carmela Monk Crawford. And as you all know, we had an amazing Zoom-a-thon on Tuesday night. If you missed it live, you want to make sure to catch the replay on our Facebook page or on our YouTube channel. And I'm going to be honest with you, we are getting so many new followers, so many new subscribers as a result of this. And so I love it. I'm excited. Our Instagram has over 1,000 followers. I like it. Facebook is now at 13,000, over 700. I like it. This is what I want. All right. I want 15,000 subscribers before 2020 is out on Facebook. I want 1,000 subscribers on YouTube before 2020 is out. All right. So make sure you go to our YouTube channel, subscribe. We have so much content that we are sharing with you and excited to continue to share with you. So again, I need 1,000 subscribers on YouTube, y'all. All right. 1,000 subscribers on YouTube before 2020 is over, and 15,000 followers and likes on the Facebook page before 2020 is over. Now you've got a good 3 months left in you. So that means that I need you to like, share this content with other people online so that they can continue to remain in conversation with us. Now, today we have an amazing guest, a friend, colleague. Really, I consider him to be a mentor of mine, who is very learned and has an expertise kind of in the topic that we're really going to get into. And as many of you know, we've got this Breonna Taylor situation going down, and between Carmela and our guest, we are going to help make sense of all of it for you. And as we always do, find the hope in this headline, because this is what we do here at What's the Message. So I'm so excited to present to you the Dr. Tim Golden. He is a professor of philosophy and legal studies. He is the program coordinator at Walla Walla University in College Place, Washington, where he both teaches courses in and does research in philosophical theology, African-American philosophy, critical race theory, and constitutional law and criminal procedure. He has a law degree from the Thurgood Marshall School of Law at Texas Southern University and a PhD in philosophy from the University of Memphis. Now, before his career as an academic philosopher, he worked as a criminal defense attorney in his hometown of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, representing indignant criminal defendants in state and federal court, handling trials, appeals, and post-conviction cases. Above all else, he is merely a sinner saved by God's outrageous, unbelievable, amazing grace, and he lives in Walla Walla University. And as you all know, we have so much going on concerning this grand jury case. And Carmela, I really would like to kind of know your thoughts. You know, what are you hearing, seeing, and what do you believe is going on around this failure to indict, really, around the grand jury trial regarding the Breonna Taylor case?
Wow, Claudia, this is, that's the billion-dollar question. That is what the unrest this summer has been about in returning. I mentioned last week during the podcast that during the March on Washington, I had the opportunity to speak to Breonna Taylor's aunt and uncle. And I asked her, I said, well, what's happening? What's going on? Because this is over a month ago. And she said, they keep going back and forth. They don't know what they want to do. They had to start all over again in terms of the investigation and start all over in terms of putting things together. And so in answer to your question, none of us is truly sure what is happening. But what we're seeing is a reluctance of Daniel Cameron to take this case all the way. And this is why he, and maybe we're putting it back, I don't need to tell the whole story. The grand jury came back with an indictment against one officer. Officer Hankinson was indicted just for the willful shooting or the wanton shooting that landed into the walls leading into another apartment. No one was indicted regarding the death or any of the gunshots to Breonna Taylor's sleeping body. And that's why we're here today, just as frustrated as people all around the world who are watching this case. And so I guess what brings us here today is the fact that there was one of the jurors on the grand jury that asked that the transcripts and the proceedings be released. And so that people can see, and I guess the feeling or the thought was that what was presented to the grand jury was not the whole, it was not all of that could have been presented, and that the grand jury was somehow being made to be a shield for Daniel Cameron, the AG. But that is just where we are, and from a rudimentary understanding. I guess the question, and this, we are so honored to see Dr. Tim Golden, our friend, the mind. If Claudia is the king of killer content, and I look at Tim Golden and I just call him the mind. The mind. I'd love to hear from you. We're going to get the chance to talk about this whole case, and hopefully before the show is over, I want to talk about you and what you're doing with your life, because I think people need to know the interesting kinds of things this Renaissance man, legal mind, is doing with his life right now. But Dr. Tim Golden, talk to us. I think we should start from the idea of the grand jury. You teach this stuff. You've practiced in court. You've had to go and defend a case after someone has been indicted. Talk to us about what a grand jury is and how it operates.
Sure. Well, first off, thank you, Carmela, and thank you, Claudia. I'm honored to be here in the presence of two beautiful, amazing Black women who are extremely talented and using all of your gifts to promote God's kingdom in this forum and elsewhere. So as honored as you may be to have me, you multiply that by 10, and I'm as honored as that to be here with you. So thank you both so much for having me. So grand juries, when we hear the word jury, right, we usually think of 12 people in a courtroom, and in just 2 days, we will be, I don't know how many folks will be celebrating it, but it's worthy of mentioning now. In just 2 days, it will be the 25th anniversary of the verdict in the O.J. Simpson case. And if you remember, 25 years ago, the racial divisions were so stark because Black folk were celebrating and white people were sort of just losing their minds and in anguish and so forth. I say that really as a footnote to this conversation so that we can measure just how little racial attitudes have changed, right? Here we are 25 years after O.J. Simpson, and the rancor and division among people in the United States on the question of race is still very much alive and well, even as we have a president who puts a white supremacist group on call. So it's in that context that we talk about the death of Breonna Taylor, right? So we have a jury that we usually think of as 12 people who are sitting there listening to lawyers argue about whether someone is innocent or guilty, right? Well, a grand jury is typically an assembly of 23 citizens who come together, and a grand jury, unlike a jury in a trial, a grand jury's function is investigative. A grand jury has investigative powers. The real problem with grand juries as they relate to the Breonna Taylor case is that their work is done in secret. The proceedings happen with just a prosecutor in the courtroom. Now, there's an old saying, Carmela, among us lawyers, that you can indict a ham sandwich, right? The reason why you can indict a ham sandwich is precisely because even though the 23 people ultimately make the decision about whether or not someone can be charged with a crime, the prosecutor is in complete control over what evidence gets presented to the grand jury. And the prosecutor is also in complete control of what charges are recommended to the grand jury.
Can you put a pin just right there, because I don't want to leave this too quickly. Number one, where do they get the grand jurors from?
Grand jurors, if I'm not mistaken, are usually taken from public records like voter registration rolls, right? So we talk about when people are called for jury duty, they're usually taken from voter registration rolls. So if you're not registered to vote, you're probably not going to get called for jury service, right? And if you or sometimes they may go by other public records like driver licenses, etc. So the 23 people are called in and they're impaneled, and their job is to consider the evidence that comes from the prosecutor and determine whether or not there is probable cause to believe that that a crime has been committed, and B, that the person who's the target of the investigation committed the crime. That's what a grand jury is supposed to do. Now, in the Breonna Taylor...
Sorry, why does it have to be secretive?
So historically, grand juries have been secretive for a number of reasons. One is that they are generally used in organized crime prosecutions when witnesses are often intimidated by people. And so often, to protect the identity of witnesses, the grand jury proceedings have happened in secret. That's one of the rationales for them, is that if someone knows that they're being investigated, then you're going to have a much harder time catching them, right? So there's that rationale. And then there's the rationale that in certain instances, we want to protect witnesses from retaliation and intimidation, which in some cases, I think, is a good reason to hold on to grand juries. But in the Breonna Taylor case, this is a unique situation because Breonna Taylor represents the latest in a stream of Black people who are doing ordinary, everyday activities and who end up getting shot and killed by police officers. Tatiana Jefferson was at her home outside of Dallas, Texas, playing video games with her nephew, and she was shot and killed by a police officer. Sandra Bland, right, found hanging in her jail cell. So we have this problem, right? It keeps recurring, and the public, Black people and other people of goodwill, members of the public, want to get some sense that police are going to be held accountable. And the problem with using grand juries in situations like Breonna Taylor's is that there is no transparency. The public does not know what happened. I mean, the fact that a grand juror had to hire a lawyer and ask for the transcripts to be made public speaks to this problem. The administration of criminal justice is all about balancing the competing interests of the defendant or the person charged versus a public interest in the fair administration of criminal justice. I think there's a better way to handle cases like Breonna Taylor's, and that's this. There's another kind of proceeding. It's called a preliminary hearing. In some jurisdictions, it may be called a probable cause hearing. This is a hearing that takes place in front of a judge where the defendant is present and the defendant is able to get a lawyer and the prosecutor is present, and the prosecutor no longer has while the prosecutor still has control over what evidence is presented, the prosecutor in a preliminary hearing or a probable cause hearing can't stand on their head and pick their nose and just say, oh, well, I tried, right? Yeah. So in a preliminary hearing or a probable cause hearing, here's what I think should have happened in the Breonna Taylor case.
All right.
You have this hail of gunfire go into these people's houses, it goes into her apartment. She ends up dead. Her boyfriend fires in self-defense, and now you have all this gunfire. She's killed by 5 gunshots, I think. Shot 5 times. So what do? Well, if Jamal shoots Ray, Jamal is not going to be indicted by a grand jury. He may be, but he may not be. In the jurisdiction like where I'm from, Philadelphia, Jamal's going to be arrested. The DA is going to charge Jamal by criminal complaint, and Jamal is going to have the opportunity to get a lawyer and come to court, and there's going to be a preliminary hearing. Right. It is open to the public. The district attorney will then go forward with evidence, and the judge will determine if that evidence is sufficient to support the charges in the complaint. If it's not, if the judge determines the evidence is insufficient, then the judge will dismiss the charges and the case is over. Now, I don't think
it's open.
It's open. It's open. Everybody can see it. And people can see what is happening. And more importantly, the prosecutor is held accountable to the people who elected him or her. He can't just say like Daniel Cameron, oh, I did my best and now that's it. Because now you have one of the people on the grand jury challenging his every assertion.
Well, let's talk about that right there, because I think that is fabulous. And first of all, I can't believe, I'm listening to you, and I'm like, I can't believe I'm enjoying this conversation about the procedure in the background. Is this percolating something in me? Not that I like this, but it's like, yeah, why didn't they do this with a preliminary hearing? That's what I was accustomed to in the jurisdiction where I used to work in criminal defense as well. But the question, I think 2 things that I wanted to go back to. One, when we look at this, because you're talking about the imbalance of power in this proceeding, when we're talking about this, we're talking about, we're calling it the Breonna Taylor case or the Sandra Bland case. But these are the people who were the victims in this case. Right. The defendants of this case are not people, as you are saying, these are not people who are witnesses that are subject to a lot of the other influences and subject to the intimidation. They have the whole weight and force of the state on their side. Exactly. And so this case is about the defendants being police officers. And so I think the same sense of secrecy and protection, especially in this kind of thing that we know what it is. This is not an undercover case. This is not a sting. This is a thing when they went in, we all know what happened, and this should be out in the open.
It should be.
I'm with you.
What we're seeing here in this situation involving Breonna Taylor is it's almost a carbon copy of what happened in Michael Brown's case. Right. 6 years ago. You had this long grand jury investigation. The public, listen, and for all the people who are watching on Facebook and in other forums, Black people in America have zero confidence that the criminal justice system works for them. And as citizens of the United States, it is a problem when a large segment of the population does not believe that the legal system works for them. That should upset everybody. whether you're black, white, red, yellow, brown, what have you. And so here's the larger point that I want to make. So if you have a preliminary hearing, right, now all of a sudden the DA is thinking, because media can go to the preliminary hearing, family members can go to the preliminary hearing. It's an adversarial proceeding that's open to the public. The defendants are not deprived of any rights. They have lawyers. They've been charged by criminal complaint. They have lawyers. There's a neutral third party there, a judge. And this is what I think should have happened. Now, Carmela and Claudia, if I break into your house and you shoot a gun at me in self-defense and I shoot you back, I cannot then claim self-defense because I was on your property unlawfully in the first place, right? I committed B and E. I broke and entered. I've committed a burglary. So I'm not lawfully present. So any legitimate claim of self-defense presupposes the lawful presence of the person making that claim. So let's go back and let's take a look at why the officers were even at Breonna Taylor's front door in the first place at nearly 1 o'clock in the morning on March 13th. Well, let's think about this for a minute. I've heard news reports that have suggested that a search warrant was issued for her apartment in January because an ex-boyfriend, Jamarcus Glover, who was suspected of selling drugs, had been seen at her apartment. Now, the search warrant was issued in January. The search warrant was not executed until March. That's a time period of nearly 2 months. Now, the police officer's conduct, all police conduct is governed by the 4th Amendment and by the 14th Amendment. 4th Amendment says you can't conduct a search without probable cause. So what happens? You have these officers who are executing a search warrant based on information that had been gleaned nearly 2 months prior. Well, under the Constitution, probable cause must exist at the time the search warrant is executed, not at the time the search warrant is issued. So if you are executing a search warrant based upon stale information, you are in violation of the Constitution, and thus your presence at Breonna Taylor's apartment is unlawful.
Sheesh.
And if your presence at her apartment is unlawful, your claim of self-defense fails. Now, Carmela and Claudia, I have never been a prosecutor, right? I don't know if I could be a prosecutor. I went to law school because I wanted to represent poor people that got accused of committing crimes. But if a prosecutor is doing his or her job, that prosecutor should have charged by criminal complaint and then stood in court and made that argument that I just made. You make that argument and you charge those officers with, at a minimum, reckless homicide. And then the case goes to trial. And if the judge doesn't think that the evidence is strong enough, then let the judge dismiss the charges and everybody goes home and nobody has questions, right? But as it's done now, what we've done is we've allowed the prosecutor to remain unaccountable to the people who've elected him, right? We've also allowed Black people to continue to believe that the system does not work for them, and because of the lack of transparency. So if you opened it up to a preliminary hearing, you can kill 2 birds with 1 stone. 1, the prosecutor has to do their job, and 2, everybody can see what is happening, and nobody has questions. And there's Thurgood Marshall used to say, he said in one of his dissenting opinions on the Supreme Court, that democracy dies behind closed doors. And when you close it off, when you close off in this type of case, now, if you're prosecuting, I've seen cases where there's a lot of people in our community who have been victims of witness intimidation. If there's cases involving drug dealers or organized crime, etc., you can keep the grand jury for cases like that. Right. But in situations like this, where public confidence it can be severely undermined, you need to dispense with, forget about using grand juries, because people need to see. People need to see what's happening.
And I think that, what you're saying is so good too, because I think when we're thinking about police officers and police departments, and then on top of that, attorney generals, district attorneys, et cetera, you're all talking about servants of the community. So if there is some kind of a criminal or wrongdoing that has been committed by a servant of the community, then the community should, by law, have access to whatever proceedings are going to take place to hold that particular elected or appointed official accountable. Now, one thing that I'm kind of wondering, and that's going through my mind right now, Dr. Golden, is the stand your ground law. Because as talking, it sounds very familiar to kind of the Trayvon Martin case and that situation with that grand jury as well, in that George Zimmerman got off because he was standing his ground, because he was, engaging in self-defense. So is it possible that, because I have always felt like white people get to claim stand your ground and Black people don't, because Kenneth Walker is clearly in his house, clearly standing his ground. And I'm from Michigan. So I'm from a traditionally red state, though it's blue right now. And we absolutely kind of subscribe to that stand your ground mentality, that stand your ground law. If you come on my property and I shoot you on my property, I'm good, because you ain't got no business being here. And so I feel as though Kentucky kind of operates in a similar way. It's another Midwestern kind of Southern state that is very much so bear arms, right to bear arms kind of a state. So what is it that, individuals, it seems as though white individuals kind of get to exercise the stand your ground law, and Black people in their own homes, even against the police, don't get to exercise that right?
Well, yeah, that's right, Claudia. And so you're speaking to the racial undertones, right, of what's happening. And I think in cases like the Breonna Taylor situation, what we're dealing with is an unspoken privilege afforded to police officers. A lot of people are hearing that soon as they hear the police were there to execute a search warrant, well, then it was okay. Charles Barkley decides that he wants to run his mouth, right? This ain't the case because they shot at cops and the cops were just because police were executing a search warrant does not mean that the police were lawfully present.
Right.
Just because you have a search warrant doesn't mean that their presence there was legal. And the reality is that the police officers enjoy a heightened presumption of innocence that is not afforded to average everyday citizens. And that is unacceptable. The relationship between prosecutors and police officers is far too cozy. That relationship has to be complicated. It has to be severed in some ways, right? Because DAs and cops, they see themselves as working together and also as looking out for one another. And you can't administer justice fairly if the fox is watching the hen house, right? You can't do that. So I think the problem with the stand your ground in this situation is that, well, we're just not going to charge the officers. But if you take away the guns and badges and they were ordinary, everyday citizens who were trying to break in, Kenneth Walker never would have been charged at all, right? And all three of them would have been arrested and they would have been indicted and they would have been charged. But because the DA has this cozy relationship with the police, he's like, oh, don't worry about it, man. I'm going to go in here, do this grand jury thing. He probably, who knows what this juror is going to say. Right. And who knows what the transcripts are going to reveal. I wouldn't be surprised if the court stenographer is like, you know, Mr. Cameron has his back to the jury. He's eating his lunch and, you know, he's saying, so what do you think about this wanton endangerment charge? You think maybe, you know, doing this lukewarm, lackluster job when the people elected you to be an administrator of justice. It doesn't mean that you seek convictions, but a good prosecutor investigates alleged violations of the law and then brings charges based upon those violations. And I don't think that was done in this case. And you know, the question as we prepare to vote, I want to say this too. It's very important.
Make the public service announcement. Go ahead.
If you know, Carmela and Claudia, and I know y'all know this, if Joe Biden and Kamala Harris win the election, it's not going to change anything for Black people overnight. But here's what will start to change things. If wherever you live, you begin to pay attention to your race for district attorney, you begin to pay attention to your race for sheriff, you begin to stop throwing away those jury notifications and saying, child, nobody got time to be going down there. I got to go to work and blah, blah, blah. You will stop making excuses for jury service. You will maintain your voter registration because that's where they're going to find you to call you in for jury service. And you are going to go to candidate forums year in and year out in your locality, in your municipality, and you're going to ask questions of people who are running for district attorney. Hey, listen, are you prepared as a matter of policy in your office to eliminate the use of grand juries in police shooting cases?
Right.
Because if you're not, then maybe you're not worthy of my vote. Are you prepared to eliminate? Do you support the notion that prosecutorial misconduct should obviate or eliminate qualified immunity and make a district attorney's office liable for malicious prosecution of people? And if it's found out that there was intentional misconduct of a prosecutor and someone has spent decades in prison, are you going to establish a conviction integrity unit? Are you going to work to make sure justice is served? These are the kinds of things that will create change or at the micro level. So I want to encourage people to begin thinking, as angry as we all are and as frustrated as we all are over the results of this Breonna Taylor situation, it's very important that we channel that, right, into some sort of sustained political involvement at the micro level so that we can help change things for the better in the long term.
There's something that's in the back of my head, that is, I guess, sort of piggybacks on what Claudia was asking and what you said before. It really bothers me, and it's hard for me to get out of my anger when we realize that these events unfolded based on mistake, or based on, they're the ones, sorry for the pun, that are triggering the events that put people at risk. And so, like in the Trayvon Martin case, but for George Zimmerman's idea that he needed to get out and pursue this young man, that he needed to do something that then caused him to claim he needed self-defense. And I think that's a part that's really bothering me, is that why is it that we're seeing police and other people being protected in their folly, in their mistake, and in their unlawful triggering of events? Why is that? What is going on behind there?
Yeah, so I think, and this is really that's really a great question, Carmela. And what I would argue is that in George Zimmerman and Trayvon Martin, in George Zimmerman and Trayvon Martin situation, they are operating against the backdrop of white supremacy and Black inferiority that really is ever present. It's an ever present specter of sorts in our world. Trayvon Martin, and as it is the case with most Black people, men and women, are present even when we're absent. We have such stereotypes about us that a lot of whites form images of us before we're even seen. And as soon as we are seen, we are automatically seen as criminal, as suspicious, as up to no good. And when George Zimmerman operating with these images, right, in his head, this image of the Black thug, right, this image of the hoodie wearing Black thug, whose clothing and whose epidermis indicate that he is a suspect, right? He sees that before he sees Trayvon Martin. So when he sees Trayvon Martin, he just sort of almost subconsciously brings him under that, and he says, "Oh, this guy's up to no good, so I'm going to follow him." And so that's the white supremacy part, or that's the Black inferiority part. And the white supremacy part is that I am able to do that despite the fact that I'm not a trained police officer, right?
Right.
I can do that because I'm white, right? Or because I hold a position of authority. And in virtue of me holding this position because of my whiteness, I can subject other people to random violence. Now, if you flip that and look at police officers, if you look at the other side of this, you know, we cannot deny the history of policing in this country, right? Policing begins after slavery when wealthy white plantation owners convinced poverty-stricken former overseers who now have no jobs, right? Because there's nothing to oversee, right? Slavery is over, so you're out of work. And the wealthy white plantation owners convinced the poor overseers, hey, listen, these Black folks are going to take your jobs.
Yeah.
They're going to take your money. They want affirmative action. They're up there talking about going to the Freedmen's Bureau and getting 40 acres and a mule. And you're white. You deserve better than them. And so it's in that context that Black men and women begin to be policed in America. And that history of policing is front and center when the police approach Breonna Taylor's front door, when the police pull over Philando Castile and his girlfriend, when the police tell Terrence Crutcher in Oklahoma to put his hands up and he's shot and killed. All of these various instances of police killing unarmed Black people are instances of a historical reality that it's almost algorithmic. It just repeats itself over and over and over again. And that's why the treatment is so uneven. That's why we privilege police in a way that we don't the ordinary, average, everyday citizen, especially when that citizen is Black.
That is so good. You know, I'm really glad that you took that turn, because that's kind of the turn that I also wanted to go down, that of law and order, right? So we're hearing a lot of that, whether that was within the Republican National Convention and, you know, Vice President Mike Pence's speech, you know, when he's talking about how don't worry, you know, we will get rid of the violence happening in the streets. You know, we'll get rid of the rioting, the looting, and we will establish law and order. Or within even the presidential debate that happened on Tuesday night, you know, as they're trying to have conversations about race, you know, you're given the opportunity to denounce white supremacy. And instead of kind of doing that, our current president decides to have conversations about law and order and about stand back and stand by, you know, kind of explicitly calling out what is or has been tagged a violent white supremacist terror group. And so with that, you know, with that kind of context, right, you know, what does it mean what really is law and order? Is law and order something that should be established? Because on the flip side of all that, we also have groups like the Black Lives Matter movement and other kind of grassroots organizations calling for the dismantling or the defunding of police departments, depending on kind of where you are on that spectrum. So what does it mean to have law and order in a society? Whose responsibility is it to establish law and order in a society?
Wow, Claudia, that's heavy. So let me try to address that in this way. So there's a difference between law and order on one hand and justice on the other, right?
Come on.
Law. What is lawful is often terribly unjust.
Yeah.
And what is just is sometimes unlawful, right? It was just for Daniel to open his window and pray 3 times a day when he found out that the king had signed a writing prohibiting his worship, right? It was just for him to do that, but it was unlawful. The same way it was just for the Hebrew boys to refuse to bow to the image of Nebuchadnezzar. Just, but unlawful. The same way it was just but unlawful for Jesus in Luke 7 to reach out and touch the coffin of the widow's son, the widow of 9. Because under the rabbinical law, you weren't, not only were you not supposed to touch a dead body, you weren't supposed to touch anything that was touching a dead body.
Right.
But the scriptures, Luke is very intentional about that. He says Jesus reached out, and in the King James Version, the word buyer is used, B-I-E-R, which basically means coffin. It says he reached out and touched the buyer, right? So God will often do just things that are unlawful, and human beings will do lawful things that are terribly unjust. So when the president decides that he's going to have a photo op in front of a church holding up a Bible and have the way cleared by American military personnel, right? That's his idea of law and order, but it is an act, ultimately, it's an act of law and order that is terribly unjust, right? So this idea of law and order and its rhetorical deployment in the midst of a world that is of a world of white supremacy that is determined to treat effects but not causes. You know, Dr. King said not long before he died, he said somebody in the news media asked me if I was going to support a moratorium on demonstrations and protests. And he said, I will support a moratorium on demonstrations and protests when there is a moratorium on injustice.
There you go.
Right? You cannot, you know, he was famous, he quoted the great poet Victor Hugo, who said, where there is darkness, crimes will be committed, but the one at fault is not only he who commits the crime, but he who caused the darkness, right? So we can talk about rioting and looting, and it's a political talking point, right? Everybody's got to come out and everybody has to condemn rioting and looting, but almost no one is required to condemn the injustice that leads to that. Right. So law and order becomes this rhetorical device that conjures up all sorts of tropes of white supremacy that tells white people that this is a way to maintain the status quo. And I just think it's important for us to distinguish between that, because that use of law and order does typically, I mean, the rule of law is important to a democracy, but I find it interesting that the way the president and his supporters, many of his supporters, are using that term is not in an inclusive way to say law and order means that African Americans and other marginalized groups are no longer marginalized or included in the American family. That's one thing, right? But it's another thing to say law and order is the way we keep things the way they are. That law and order is a way to maintain the status quo. And I think that's how that term is being used nowadays.
Man,
go
ahead, Carmela.
I love the fact that you are playing this out, because in the last few days, Claudia and I have seen that there are people who are Christians, and they have a hard time that this is a discussion that they may not hear other places. They have a hard time understanding that the experience that Black people have is not the same as theirs. And therefore the narrative is different. You have to understand that when you hear law and order, that those are not virtues to people who have been on the perennial side of injustice. Law and order, it's a joke. It's a laughing call, and it's not just an appeal to lawful citizens. It's an appeal to unlawful citizens who are going to wreak havoc on what you call freedom in America. And so
Carmela and Claudia, I'm sorry, Carmela, I didn't mean.
Go ahead.
Can I just share with the two of you that I converted to Seventh-day Adventism when I was a first-year law student, and you know what convinced me to go into the water? I mean, I'm just going to be real with you. When I took a Daniel Revelation seminar, and when we got to Revelation 13, and the elder giving me the Bible study started talking about America in prophecy, and the way that she would treat people in the end, I remember raising my hand in the Bible study and saying, well, wait a minute, that's been going on since slavery. And it was in that moment that it all started to make sense to me. So after that Bible study, I was like, when do I get baptized? Where do I sign up for this, right? Because there's something radical about Adventist theology, rightly conceived, right? We try to globalize it a lot. And I'm not knocking any of the mission work or any of the other things that we do in other parts of the world. But as a denomination, it's important for Seventh-day Adventists to understand that whether you want to admit it or not, the Seventh-day Adventist Church was forged in the midst of a civil war in the United States over the question of what to do with 3.5 million Black people who were enslaved.
That's it.
And the reality is that if you're a Seventh-day Adventist today in the United States of America, you benefit from Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And that's the law that prohibits discrimination in the workplace on the basis of religion. And so every time you ask your pastor for a Sabbath accommodation letter, you are invoking a legacy of resistance to injustice that goes back to the end of Jim Crow and the work of Dr. King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference that the General Conference of Seventh-day Adventists opposed in the 1960s. So if you're a Seventh-day Adventist in America today, you literally reap where you did not sow.
Mercy.
And so we got to get our act together on this thing and realize that if you're a Seventh-day Adventist, your theology is inextricably connected to the African-American experience. That's a tough pill for a lot of our brethren to swallow, but it is reality, whether you like it or not.
I love this because we are inviting people to reconnect with those spiritual roots that fight for justice and freedom. I love that. And Claudia, I don't mean to overstep you when you ask this question, but I was going to say that going back to Breonna Taylor, I find sort of hope in the idea that one grand juror said, no, wait a minute, this narrative is going down the wrong way. And I'm about to call it right now. I'm getting a lawyer and we're going to hear and do something, because we don't ever see this. And for me, I think this may be and I don't know what's going to come out on the other side of it, but just the fact that they stopped the flow and said, hey, look, what's going to happen? What do you think, Tim Golden?
I think that this is a moment in the Breonna Taylor situation, Carmela. This is a moment that is going to either make or break the privilege that we afford to police officers in police killings. Either it's going to reinforce it or it's going to cause it to be dismantled. I hope it's the latter. I hope that district attorneys around the country have enough of a sense of fairness and justice to say, you know what, we're in the business of promoting public confidence in what we do, not undermining it. There's nothing. And you know what I really don't like is the misappropriation of the word mob mentality as it relates to Black Lives Matter or any of the other protesters, because the term mob is a term that really goes back to the white supremacist use of lynching in the post-Reconstruction era. So the appropriation of certain rhetorical ideas like mob, the misappropriation of it is just a way for, I think, some white people to sort of co-opt the racial victimization of Black people and use it to shield white police officers, right? I mean, to me, there's something terribly wrong with that. So, but this moment, this Breonna Taylor moment in American history, and it's so fitting, right, that it would be a Black woman, right, who would force us to reckon with ourselves and all of the difficulties, because Black women have done so much for America and have made America, you know, President talks about making America great again. If anybody has made America great, it's the contributions and efforts of so many Black women. So I think that this moment is going to be a moment of reflection. It's going to be a moment that hopefully will cause people to take a close look at the George Floyd Fairness in Policing Act that is now has been proposed in Congress. I understand the CBC proposed it back in June or July. We also have pending the John Lewis Voting Rights Restoration Act, right? So I'm hoping that we can, in this Breonna Taylor moment, use her legacy to affect meaningful change, to really immortalize her, right? Because she is immortal. She will live forever in the annals of American history and American social, political, and cultural life. And if you are a Seventh-day Adventist Christian and you're wondering about prophecy, just look at what's happened the past 4 years, and you'll see that America's turn on her citizens won't be some event in the distant future. It's a turn that has been happening since 1619. It's been going on. There was slavery before there was America, right? So this has been happening for a long time, and I hope that this moment will break in favor of good reform, solid reform, that will complicate the relationship and sever the relationship in many cases between police and prosecutors, and that will help us stop according this privilege to police officers where we make assumptions. And this is one point I really need to make. I don't want to take too much time, but I really need to say this. After World War II, in the Nazi war crimes trials, the defense of many of the Nazis under Hitler was, I was just doing my job. I was just doing my duty. These police officers who went to Breonna Taylor's house, it's well established, were not involved at all in the initial investigation. They were supposedly just doing their duty. They were just doing their job. Oh, we can't blame them. They were just doing their job. Well, wait a minute. That excuse didn't work in Hitler's Germany, and it shouldn't work in Trump's America either. If you're a police officer and you're on roll call that night and you get assigned to SWAT detail and you're looking at a warrant that you see is issued based on information from 6 weeks ago, don't you think you should speak up and say, wait a minute, man, should we even be going to this house? Like, there's something wrong with this military, this unreflective military chain of command style in policing that puts us in the position of Hitler's Germany, where police say, I was just doing my duty. That is unacceptable. Breonna Taylor's life is gone. It's gone, and it's not dignified by any legal proceedings. It was almost as though the state treats her as though she's inconsequential, like she didn't matter. That's unacceptable. It's unacceptable to members of our community, and it should be unacceptable to every American citizen of goodwill.
Yeah, Mark Lamont Hill puts it extremely well in his book, Nobody, that came out. It was based on the Mike Brown shooting, but also Eric Garner and several others. But he calls it Nobody because one of the eyewitnesses of the Mike Brown case said they treated him like he was nobody. And Mark Lamont Hill kind of expounds on that, saying nobody, no state duty bound to protect him or serve him, no state duty bound to offer him medical care. I think that that's just kind of right in line with, the Breonna Taylor situation. People said that when she was shot, she was not dead immediately, but that she was kind of laying on the ground dying. And not one of those three officers called for any medical help, assistance, and did not even treat her themselves. And so where are we in a society where you can have three police officers on duty in a home? They shoot up a home unlawfully, and an EMT worker is killed in the process. And there is no attention to her wounds. I think that is that's devastating. And Carmela has both you and Carmela have kind of shared where the hope is kind of in this thing, and I think that's where we have to continue to look. You have to continue to look for the hope in these kinds of headlines. And as Carmela said, I think this juror who has made the motion for the recordings and the transcripts to be released is some semblance of hope in all of this. Dr. Golden, as we close, are there any projects, anything that you would like to share with our audience that are coming out in the near future that you want to tell any of them about?
Sure. Well, thank you, Claudia, for asking that. And so if all goes well, next year will be a very good year for me. I won't be too hard for it to be better than 2020. That's for sure. But if I wake up on New Year's Day, 2021, it'll be a better year already than 2020. But I have 3 books that will hopefully be out next year. One is a book called Racism and Resistance. The subtitle is Essays on Derek Bell's Racial Realism. It's an edited volume. And in that book, I have contributions from Black scholars across disciplines. I have a contribution from a wonderful womanist theologian named Dr. Carrie Day. She's at Princeton Theological Seminary. And they are all reflections on this problem of racism that Derek Bell diagnosed. The problem of racism on one hand being permanent, but on the other hand, demanding our resistance, right? So there's this tension in his thought, and all of the essays in that volume speak to that. I have another book manuscript that as soon as we get off this Zoom call, I got to get back to work on editing it. It's a book called Frederick Douglass and the Philosophy of Religion, an interpretation of narrative, art, and politics. And it's a criticism of what I call sort of a white orientation to philosophy of religion that abstracts God away and makes God more about doctrine and less about justice. And I use Frederick Douglass and his criticisms of Christianity, slaveholding Christianity, to sort of make that case. I'm currently working on 2 book chapters. One of them is called On a Hill Far Away, The Problem of Black Male Death in Black Christianity. And another one is called law and medicine. Why I Can't Breathe makes me so nervous. So next year will hopefully be a good year for me. I hope to get all this stuff done and finish my homework so I can go outside and play.
That's some heavy stuff, and and I didn't want to go without the people who are watching, without them knowing how you are a prolific actor as well.
Oh, thank you,
Written
Claudia.
and appeared on stage as well, and you were in the role, in fact, as Thurgood Marshall a couple of years ago, and I know you've been in other plays, which is just a marvelous, an example of a Renaissance man.
Oh,
in the
thank
current
you.
day and age.
Thank you, Claudia. Well, if all goes well next year, I got a note yesterday from a director, a film director in Portland. It'll be my first foray onto the screen. I've done mostly stage work, but there's a film going on about Black loggers in Portland, Oregon. And he said he's interested in casting me for a role. So we'll see what happens. My theatrical performances, as you can imagine with the pandemic, have been eliminated this year, right? Because theaters are indoor activity, and when you're on stage, you're close contact and, can't wear a mask. And so hopefully as things return back to some sense of normal, I'll get to do that again. But I enjoy doing that too. I'm a big fan of August Wilson, his work. My goal is to perform in all 10 of his plays. I've performed in 3, so I've got 7 to go. So we'll see what happens.
Awesome.
That is awesome, man. Well, Dr. Golden, I am so grateful to you. Thank you so much for just granting us, just a bit of your time. As you have stated, you just have so much going on. And so I'm so grateful that you just kind of gave us a sliver. To all of you who are watching, many of you might know, as I stated at the beginning of the show, that on Tuesday evening, Carmela and myself had the opportunity to work with Sheldon Kennedy, as well as Robert Baker, on doing a live show called a Zoomathon. And basically this was a fundraiser to kind of raise subscriptions for the magazine and the ministry, but as well as raise donations for our ministry so that we can continue to ensure that Message Magazine is circulating in prisons, so that we can continue to ensure that the vision that our editor-in-chief has for the direction that she would like to take the magazine is something that we can financially, accomplish. And so that was a very successful night. That flyer has been circulated all over social media, and we are extremely grateful that the North American Division of Seventh-day Adventists also picked up the flyer. They shared it on their Twitter, on their Instagram, as well as on their Facebook pages. And that means the world to us, because while we are an organization that is seeking to provide relevant content to Black people, regardless of their religious affiliation, we are a Seventh-day Adventist magazine. And so we are still connected to the institution of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And so when the Seventh-day Adventist Church is supporting our content, supporting our efforts, that means everything to us. And so we have been made aware that on the North American Division's Facebook page, they shared that flyer, and many individuals responded with a lot of negativity, a lot of hate, and many of you saw those comments. And we simply want to share that while it is disheartening for us to see a variety of individuals write disparaging comments about Message Magazine, suggesting that because we are a Black focused magazine, we are a racist magazine. These kinds of statements are most certainly disheartening, but they are not a reflection, one, of Message Magazine, nor do we believe that they are a reflection of the institution that is Seventh-day Adventism. And so we want to come behind the North American Division and say thank you for posting this flyer. Thank you so much for supporting Message as a ministry and as a publication. Thank you for putting our content on your platforms. And we are so grateful for both your public and private support. And so while many of you have been disheartened by these comments and by this rhetoric, we just want to encourage you that while there might be Seventh-day Adventists that are racist, while there might be individual Seventh-day Adventists who comment and make disparaging content, it is of our belief that our institution, our North American division, has not supported, nor do they condone that kind of commentary. And they are in support of us as a Black Christian magazine. And so we want to publicly thank them and publicly encourage you to just continue to support us in the same way that we are trying to do the ministry and continue to build the kingdom of God. We encourage you to continue to donate, continue to subscribe, continue to help us do the work that we seek to do predominantly in Black and brown communities, because, you know, we're not here to divide, we are here to unite. And we just truly believe that if we can continue to spread the message, if we can continue to share how you can grow your faith, share tips on a plant-based diet, share tips about how, just like Dr. Golden said, prophecy is intimately connected to our current time, and also share with you our spiritual approach to a lot of the current events that are going on. We are confident that the message and the gospel of Jesus Christ can be shared throughout this country. So thank you so much for your support. We pray that this podcast and the Zoomathon and every other kind of content that we share is encouraging to you. Thank you once again to the North American Division for your support, both publicly and privately. It is not unnoticed. It is much, much appreciated. As I always say, we have an amazing lineup every single week, and we're so grateful to Dr. Golden for spending some time with us here. Next week, we are going to have another awesome conversation, and we are going to get into a plant-based diet with an amazing author that is going to be brought on by our very own Donna Green Goodman. So you do not want to miss next week. Make sure you tune in next Thursday, October 8th, at 11 a.m. This is what we do. The week after that, we also have an amazing guest, a friend of mine who is from and based in South Africa, and he is doing some amazing social justice work that is attached to architecture. And so we're going to talk with him about how to do social justice in a way that is connected to urban development, architecture, and things of that nature. So we've got an amazing lineup coming. You don't want to miss absolutely anything. So make sure you have liked and followed us right here on Facebook, so that you can get all the notifications that you need about whatever it is that we're doing with this here podcast. But all the other content we're going to be sharing. There are other podcasts, there are articles, and you do not want to miss anything that we are putting out. But like I said, I have a goal. I have goals in life. All right. And you, just like you've got goals, I got goals. And I need, like I said, I need 15,000. I need 15,000 followers on Facebook before 2020 is out. So that means you need to share this podcast. You need to share the Facebook page with people. You need to tell people Claudia's got a goal, and Claudia's trying to get 15,000 followers on Facebook. But Claudia also is trying to get 1,000 subscribers on YouTube. So you got to share the YouTube content. You got to go to YouTube and type in Message Magazine and make sure you click subscribe, because when we get 1,000 subscribers on YouTube, that means that we can do even more important content on that platform. So make sure that you subscribe to our YouTube page. Make sure you're following us on all of our social media platforms, Instagram and Twitter at Message1898. And of course, subscribe, donate, and get your copy of the bi-monthly magazine and our weekly newsletter at www.messagemagazine.com, www.messagemagazine.com. As always, it's a pleasure to be here with you. We try our best to bring you the hope in the headlines right here on What's the Message. And so next week, we will see you again. It'll be a new topic. It'll be a new guest, but it will be on the exact same channel at the exact same time. So I will see you then. All right. Thank you all so much. Have a great rest of your day.
Claudia, I think the one other thing that we have to remember,
Our behavior is definitely influenced or impacted by,
I'm a seventh-day and we know that
we're excited that with the powers of Zoom and the like, we can still the eating of certain animals. Headlines. I am your host, Claudia Allen. This is my chief executive, right? so many churches are actually
80% of the affiliates, ABC affiliates here in the United States, picked it up.
Not telling the truth and going back to let's just dip this water up.
Issues. And so we live our lives working. If you think about
Brother from another mother, the pastor, Richard Bird, and I'm telling you, you know, we handle the heavy stuff. We do the heavy stuff.